Texas, June 1943. A 42-year-old cowboy did something that American intelligence couldn't accomplish. He turned 3,200 Nazi prisoners into willing allies. His weapon, a smoker built from a salvaged oil drum. His strategy, none whatsoever. But this isn't a story about food. This is a story about the secret Sergeant Tom Mercer carried for 25 years. A secret that made him afraid every time he looked into the eyes of German prisoners. In 1918, Mercer killed a German soldier. In 1943, he tried to save 3,200 men. Can guilt be redeemed by smoke? The heat in central Texas that summer could peel paint off barn doors. 104 degrees Fahrenheit on a good day. The kind of heat that makes you wonder if the devil himself moved his operations north from hell. Camp Bowie sat in the middle of that inferno, a prisoner of war camp thrown together by the United States Army to house the overflow from the North African campaign. 3,200 German soldiers lived behind those barbed wire fences. Most had fought under Rommel in the desert campaigns, Tunisia, Libya. Some had seen action in Sicily. All had seen defeat. But defeat on the battlefield didn't mean defeat in their minds. These men still believed. They still thought Germany would rise again. They still thought the war could be won. Inside those fences, a different war was being fought. A silent war. A war the American guards couldn't see and didn't understand. The Nazi loyalists still ruled. Hardline believers who enforced discipline with violence and whispered threats. Men like Oberst Klaus Reinhardt, 45 years old, former SS Sturmbannführer, a man whose son had frozen to death in a trench outside Stalingrad. Reinhardt ran the compound with iron discipline. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make threats. When he spoke, men listened. When he gave orders, men obeyed. And when someone dared to question the Reich, when someone suggested that maybe Hitler had led them astray, when someone showed even the slightest hint of doubt, they were dealt with. 17 prisoners dead in 3 months. That was the official count. The official causes accidents, illness, natural deaths. One man supposedly drowned in a bathtub. Another supposedly hanged himself in the latrine. A third supposedly died of pneumonia. The truth was darker, and everyone knew it. These men were being murdered by their own countrymen for the crime of losing faith. Colonel Benjamin Hayes knew it. He stood in his office that Thursday afternoon in June, looking at yet another death report, feeling the weight of command settle heavier on his shoulders. He was 53 years old, a veteran of the Great War, a man with a scarred face from shrapnel at Belleau Wood and tired eyes that had seen too much death in 2 different wars. Captain Richard Voss entered the office without knocking. 38 years old, ramrod straight a man who believed that regulations could solve any problem if you just followed them with sufficient precision. Colonel, the re-education program. Hayes held up one hand to stop him. Save it, Captain. I've read your reports. 0 results, 0 progress, 0 impact. Sir, with respect, cultural transformation takes time. We need to maintain consistency with the curriculum and trust the process. Hayes turned from the window where he'd been watching German prisoners doing their morning calisthenics in perfect formation, moving like soldiers preparing for battle rather than defeated men in captivity. We don't have time, Captain. 17 men are dead. Our re-education program consists of showing them films about democracy that they laugh at and giving them newspapers that they use for toilet paper. The Nazi underground inside this camp is stronger now than it was when these men first arrived. Voss stiffened. Sir, if we could just get authorization to segregate the known agitators and isolate them from the general population. And how exactly would we identify them? They don't wear badges announcing their allegiance. They don't hold meetings in broad daylight. They operate in shadows, and they kill quietly. Hayes sat down heavily in his chair. There's a new man arriving today, Sergeant Thomas Mercer. He's going to be our cook. A cook? Voss couldn't hide the confusion in his voice. Sir, I don't see how a cook is going to help with our prisoner management issues. Neither do I, Captain. But at this point, I'm willing to try anything that doesn't involve me signing more death reports. Tom Mercer arrived at Camp Bowie at 7 in the morning, driving a Ford truck that had seen better days probably sometime around 1935. He was 42 years old, but looked older, the kind of weathering that comes from years of hard work under a hard sun. Tall and lean, wearing a faded denim shirt and a wide-brimmed cowboy hat tilted back on his head in a way that suggested he wasn't particularly concerned with military regulations. He parked his truck near the administrative building and stood for a long moment just looking at the camp. The rows of wooden barracks arranged in neat military precision. The guard towers standing sentinel at each corner. The fence line topped with coils of razor wire gleaming in the early morning sun. And beyond all that 3,000 men who still believed they were soldiers in an army that would someday rise again. Mercer didn't know it yet, but he was looking at the place where he would try to make peace with a ghost that had haunted him for 25 years. France, November 1918. Mercer was 17 years old, too young to enlist legally, so he'd lied about his age the way hundreds of thousands of other boys had done. They put him in a trench outside Amiens with a Springfield rifle and 3 weeks of training that barely qualified as adequate. He was on guard duty at 3 o'clock in the morning when he heard movement out in no man's land. The fog was thick as soup visibility, maybe 10 feet at best. He shouted the challenge password. No answer came back. He shouted again louder this time. Still nothing but silence and fog. Then a shape emerged from the darkness. A German soldier crawling through the barbed wire hands, clearly empty mouth-forming words that Mercer couldn't understand. The words sounded like Hilfe, but Mercer didn't speak German and had no idea what it meant. All he knew was that an enemy soldier was approaching his position in the middle of the night. He was 17 years old and absolutely terrified, and he did what 17-year-old terrified soldiers do when they think they're under attack. He pulled the trigger. The German soldier dropped into the mud and didn't move. Mercer stayed in his position, rifle aimed finger-tight on the trigger, waiting for more attackers to emerge from the fog, but no one else came. When dawn finally broke and the fog began to lift, Mercer climbed out of his trench to check the body. The man was dead. Maybe 25 years old, maybe 30, it was hard to tell. No weapon anywhere on him or near him. In his breast pocket, Mercer found a photograph that had somehow stayed dry. A woman holding a small boy, maybe 3 years old, both smiling at the camera. And underneath the photograph, a letter unfinished that started with the words, Liebe Maria, ich komme bald nach Hause. Mercer couldn't read German, but he understood photographs well enough. He understood that he had just killed somebody's husband, somebody's father, a man who had been trying to surrender, trying to ask for help, trying to survive long enough to get home to the people in that photograph. He took the photograph out of the dead man's pocket. He would carry it for the next 25 years, through the armistice celebrations that he couldn't bring himself to join, through the long ship ride home where other soldiers sang and celebrated while he sat alone, thinking about a German family, that would never be whole again. Through his marriage to Clara Thompson, a quiet woman from the next town over who taught school and never asked too many questions about the war. Through Clara's death from tuberculosis in 1939 when they didn't have enough money for the medicine that might have saved her, and Mercer watched her waste away, feeling helpless and guilty all over again. Through his decision to enlist again in 1942, this time as a cook, because 41 years old was too old for the infantry, and his knees weren't what they used to be anyway. For 25 years, that photograph of a German woman and her small son lived in Mercer's wallet. For 25 years, he wondered about them. Wondered if the boy grew up. Wondered if the woman remarried or spent the rest of her life waiting for a husband who would never come home. For 25 years, Tom Mercer carried the weight of a life he had taken. When he volunteered for military service this second time around, it wasn't because he wanted to fight. It wasn't because he believed in glory or honor or any of the things the recruiting posters talked about. It was because he needed to find some way, any way at all, to balance the scales, to do something that might make up for what he had done in a foggy trench in France 25 years ago. He didn't know how. He just knew he had to try. The kitchen at Camp Bowie was an absolute disaster. A wooden shed that smelled like old grease and mildew with a cast iron stove that belonged in a museum, and shelves stocked with canned meat that might have been sitting there since the Spanish-American War, powdered eggs that tasted like chalk and beans that had probably been in storage since the camp first opened. Corporal Frank Kellerman was waiting for him when he arrived. 38 years old, the camp's resident scrounger and fix-it man, a veteran of the Depression who had learned how to make something useful out of nothing during his years in the Civilian Conservation Corps. "Welcome to Paradise, Sarge," Kellerman said with a grin that suggested he knew exactly how far from paradise this place actually was. Mercer looked around the kitchen and said a word that would have gotten him in trouble if any officers had been within earshot. "This is what I'm supposed to work with. This is what I'm supposed to feed people." Army standard issue, my friend. Nutritious, economical, and guaranteed to taste like cardboard soaked in dishwater, but you get used to it after a while. Mercer picked up a can labeled simply meat product and examined it like it might explode if handled incorrectly. "How long have you been eating this stuff?" 6 months now. Like I said, you get used to it. The trick is to not think too hard about what you're actually eating. "I seriously doubt that." Mercer set the can back down on the shelf. "You got any tools around here?" "Welding equipment, sheet metal." Kellerman raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, out in the maintenance shed. Got a pretty good setup, actually." "Why, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm not serving this garbage to anybody. I'm going to cook real food. Actual food that tastes like something other than regret. The captain's gonna have some strong opinions about that, Sarge. The captain can eat beans and powdered eggs if he wants to. I'm cooking Texas barbecue." Kellerman's grin widened. "I think I'm gonna like working with you, Sarge." That night, long after the camp had gone quiet and most of the soldiers had turned in for the night, Mercer went to work. He found a 50-gallon oil drum in the salvage pile behind the motor pool, rusted but still structurally sound. Some sheets of metal that had been destined for the scrap heap. Kellerman loaned him the welding torch and showed him where the spare wire mesh was stored. Mercer had learned metalwork from his father, who had been a blacksmith back in Abilene before the automobile made that profession obsolete. He knew how to cut metal, how to weld it, how to shape raw materials into something functional and useful. It took him 4 hours of steady work, but by the time he was done, he had what he wanted. A smoker. crude and rough around the edges, but it would do the job. Firebox on one end where the wood would burn, smoking chamber in the middle where the meat would cook low, and slow chimney on the other end to draw the smoke through. By 3 o'clock in the morning, he was finished. He stepped back, wiped the grease and sweat from his hands with an old rag, and looked at what he had built. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't something you'd see in a restaurant or a fancy cookhouse, but it would work, and that was all that mattered. He gathered mesquite wood from the pile behind the maintenance shed. Mesquite was the soul of Texas, cooking the thing that made Texas barbecue different from all the other regional variations. It burned hot and slow, and the smoke it produced had a flavor you simply couldn't replicate with any other kind of wood. Sweet and sharp and absolutely distinctive. At 4 o'clock in the morning, with stars still bright overhead, and the air just beginning to hint at the brutal heat that would arrive with sunrise, Mercer lit his first fire in the smoker. He had traded 3 packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes to a supply sergeant for a 20-pound beef brisket, probably the best trade he had ever made in his military career. He rubbed the brisket down with coarse salt and cracked black pepper, nothing fancy or complicated, just good meat and simple seasoning. Then he laid it carefully on the grate inside the smoker, closed the lid, and adjusted the vents to keep the temperature low and steady. Smoking meat is an exercise in patience and faith. You can't rush it. You can't force it to cook faster no matter how hungry you are or how impatient you get. You just have to tend the fire, keep it burning steady. Add wood when needed, and trust that 6 or 8 or 10 hours from now, something beautiful will emerge. As the sun rose over Camp Bowie, turning the eastern sky from black to gray to pink to blue, smoke began to drift across the compound. Thin columns of gray-white smoke carrying a smell that had absolutely no business being in a military installation. Sweet and rich and complex, the smell of meat slowly transforming under the influence of heat and time and smoke. The American Guards noticed it first. The ritual began on the second Sunday. Mercer had made a decision without telling anyone, without asking permission, without filling out requisition forms, or submitting proposals through the chain of command. Every Sunday he would cook, not just for the American Guards, though they would certainly eat well. He would cook enough that there would be leftovers, enough that food could accidentally find its way through the fence to the men on the other side. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't psychological warfare. It was just something he needed to do. That second Sunday, he started the fire at 4 in the morning. This time it was pork shoulder, 25 pounds of it, rubbed with a mixture of paprika, brown sugar, garlic powder, and cayenne pepper. He set it in the smoker and settled in to wait, watching the sun come up over the flat Texas landscape, drinking bitter coffee from a tin cup, and thinking about things he usually tried not to think about. The photograph in his wallet felt heavier on Sundays. By 8 o'clock, the smoke was rolling thick and sweet across the compound. By 9, there were 20 German prisoners standing near the fence, not working, not exercising, just standing there watching the smoke rise and smelling something that reminded them of a world they thought they had lost forever. Emil Bauer was among them. He had come back every day since that first taste of brisket standing by the fence during his free time just watching Mercer work. The American sergeant had noticed him. Sometimes Mercer would wave. Sometimes he would nod. They didn't speak much. Emil's English was poor, and Mercer's German was worse. But something was forming between them anyway. Something that didn't need words. On this particular Sunday, something else happened. Something that would change everything. The camp's electrical generator broke down at 10 in the morning. It was an old unit, temperamental at the best of times, and the heat wasn't doing it any favors. The lights went out. The fans stopped turning. The refrigeration units that kept food from spoiling in the brutal Texas heat went silent. Captain Voss was furious. He called the motor pool, demanded they send someone to fix it immediately. The motor pool sergeant said they had called a technician from town, but he wouldn't arrive until tomorrow, at the earliest, maybe the day after that. It was Sunday. Nobody worked on Sundays if they could help it. Mercer heard about it from Kellerman, who had heard about it from a corporal who had heard Voss shouting into the telephone. Mercer wiped his hands on his apron, walked over to the motor pool, and looked at the generator. It was a diesel unit, maybe 15 years old, covered in dust and leaking oil from half a dozen different seals. "I can fix that," he said to the motor pool sergeant. The sergeant looked skeptical. "You're a cook." "I'm a lot of things. I fixed tractors and windmills for 20 years before this war started. A generator's just a diesel engine with a purpose. I can fix it." Captain Voss isn't gonna like a cook messing with mechanical equipment. Captain Voss doesn't like much of anything I do. Hasn't stopped me yet. Mercer spent 10 minutes examining the generator, tracing fuel lines, checking connections, testing compression. The problem was obvious once you knew where to look. A fuel pump had failed, starving the engine, but replacing it required tools and parts and a second pair of hands that knew what they were doing. He looked over at the fence, at the 20 German prisoners standing there, at Emil Bauer, who was watching him with the focused attention of someone who understood machinery. Mercer made a decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had been paying close attention. He walked to the fence and called out to Emil in his broken German, "Du Mechaniker." Emil straightened up. "Ja, yes, I am mechanic. I need help. Generator broken. You help me fix." Emil looked uncertain. This wasn't allowed. Prisoners weren't supposed to work on American military equipment. Prisoners weren't supposed to fraternize with guards. Prisoners certainly weren't supposed to be invited into the American compound to repair critical infrastructure. But Mercer was looking at him like the question was perfectly reasonable, like it was the most natural thing in the world to ask your enemy to help fix your generator. "I help," Emil said, finally. A guard unlocked the gate and let Emil through. Mercer led him to the generator, showed him the problem, explained what needed to be done. Emil nodded understanding immediately. His English was rough, but his knowledge of diesel engines was solid. They worked together for the next 2 hours. Mercer doing the heavy lifting, Emil doing the precision work, both of them communicating in a mixture of broken German, broken English, and the universal language of mechanics everywhere. "Hand me that wrench. Hold this steady. Try it now. No, tighten it more. Yes, like that." By noon, the generator was running again. The lights came back on. The fans started turning. Captain Voss came out to see what had happened and found Mercer and a German prisoner standing side by side, covered in grease and diesel fuel, both grinning like they had just accomplished something remarkable. Voss's face went red. "Sergeant Mercer, a word. Now." Mercer wiped his hands on a rag and followed Voss back to the administrative building. Emil returned to the prisoner compound, still grinning, carrying with him the memory of 2 hours spent doing something he was good at, something that made him feel like more than just a number in a prison camp. In Voss's office, the captain's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "What the hell do you think you were doing out there?" "Fixing the generator, sir. It's working now. You can check if you want." "You brought a prisoner into the American compound. You let him work on military equipment. You fraternized with the enemy. Do you have any idea how many regulations you just violated? Mercer met his eyes calmly. Sir, the generator was broken. I fixed it. I needed help. There was a qualified mechanic standing 20 feet away, so I asked him to help. Now it's fixed and we have electricity again. I don't see the problem. The problem is that you are completely ignoring the chain of command. You're making decisions that aren't yours to make. You're treating enemy prisoners like they're your friends. I'm treating them like people who know how to fix diesel engines, sir, because that's what they are. Voss leaned forward across his desk. I'm writing this up, Mercer. I'm documenting every violation. And I'm sending a formal recommendation to Colonel Hayes that you be transferred to another installation where you can't continue to undermine discipline and security. Yes, sir. Will that be all, sir? Get out of my office. Mercer left. He wasn't worried, or maybe he was worried, but he had made peace with it. He had spent 25 years carrying guilt for one German soldier he had killed. If trying to help 3,000 German soldiers got him transferred or court-martialed or dishonorably discharged, well, that seemed like a fair trade. He went back to his smoker. The pork shoulder was done the meat so tender it was falling apart. He pulled it off, the heat shredded it with 2 forks, and started loading paper plates. 20 German prisoners were still standing by the fence waiting. Emil was among them, and now he was talking to the others, gesturing, explaining something. Mercer couldn't hear what he was saying, but he could see the effect. The other men were listening, really listening. Mercer carried the plates to the fence and started passing them through. This time, more men reached for them, some hesitantly, some eagerly, but more than before. Word was spreading. As they ate, Mercer sat down on the American side of the fence, his back against a post, and started talking. Not lecturing, not trying to convince anyone of anything, just talking the way you might talk to neighbors at a church picnic. My wife Clara used to make pulled pork like this, he said, not sure if anyone was listening or understanding. She'd cook it all day Saturday, and by Sunday afternoon, the whole house would smell so good you could barely stand it. She'd serve it with coleslaw and cornbread and sweet tea so cold it made your teeth hurt. He paused, looking up at the men on the other side of the fence. Some were watching him, some were just eating, but they weren't leaving. She died in 1939, tuberculosis. I didn't have money for the medicine. I was working 3 jobs, and it still wasn't enough. I watched her get thinner and weaker, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. His voice was quiet now. She taught me to cook. Said good food doesn't need fancy words or complicated recipes. It just needs time and care, and maybe a little bit of love. One of the prisoners, a young man with intense eyes who Mercer would later learn was named Franz Adler, spoke up in halting English. You miss her. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Every day, Mercer said simply. Franz was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my mother. She died when I was 12. I still remember her cooking. Rinderbraten. You know this? Beef roast? Yeah, yes. On Sundays, she make this. The smell. Franz struggled to find the words. The smell was like home. You understand? Mercer nodded. I understand. That conversation changed something, not just for Franz, though it hit him hardest, for all of them standing by the fence that Sunday afternoon, eating pulled pork and listening to an American sergeant talk about his dead wife with the same kind of grief they all carried for people they had lost. Later that night, Franz lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Under his pillow was a photograph of Adolf Hitler that he had carried since joining the Hitler Youth at age 10. He had prayed to that photograph, had sworn oaths to it, had believed with absolute certainty that the man in the photograph would lead Germany to glory and create a new order that would last 1,000 years. But tonight, for the first time in 9 years, Franz pulled out the photograph and looked at it with different eyes. The American sergeant had talked about his wife dying while he worked 3 jobs trying to save her, had talked about loss and grief like it was something he understood, like it was something they all understood together. Franz's Hitler Youth instructors had taught him that Americans were weak and decadent, that they had no understanding of sacrifice or honor, that they were mongrels with no culture and no soul. But Mercer had cooked food that tasted like Franz's mother's kitchen, had talked about loss with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned his grief honestly, had invited a German prisoner to help fix an engine and treated him like a colleague instead of like a slave. None of that fit what Franz had been taught. And if that was wrong, what else might be wrong? Franz didn't burn the photograph that night. But he didn't put it back under his pillow either. He folded it and placed it in his footlocker underneath his spare socks, where he wouldn't have to look at it every day. The second Sunday became a pattern. Every week, Mercer would cook. Every week, more prisoners would gather by the fence. Every week, Mercer would share food and stories. He talked about the neighbor he'd had back in Abilene, a man named Friedrich Hoffmann, who had emigrated from Germany in 1920 and taught Mercer how to rebuild carburetors. "Best mechanic I ever knew," Mercer said. "When he died in 1935, I went to his funeral and cried like he was my own father. Some of you probably think I'm supposed to hate Germans, but I grew up next door to one, and he was one of the finest men I ever met." He talked about the Jewish baker in town, Samuel Goldstein, who made peach cobblers so good it should have been illegal. His son left for New York in 1938. Samuel told me he was scared of what was happening in Europe, scared of what was coming. He asked me to remember his recipes so they wouldn't die with him. I still make his challah bread every Friday. The prisoners listened, some with skepticism, some with growing curiosity, but they listened. And slowly, carefully, some of them started to talk back, started to tell their own stories about families in Germany, about jobs they'd had before the war, about lives that had been interrupted by history and violence and ideology. Emil talked about his father's garage in Stuttgart, about the 1936 Mercedes-Benz they had restored together, about how his father had cried when Emil was drafted. A prisoner named Otto talked about teaching mathematics at a gymnasium in Hamburg, about students who sent him letters at the front about hoping he would survive long enough to return to his classroom. Another man whose name Mercer never learned talked quietly about his brother who had been killed at Stalingrad, about how his mother back in Dresden had stopped writing letters because she couldn't bear to write words on paper anymore. These were not the stories of fanatics or monsters. These were the stories of men who had been swept up in something larger than themselves and were only now beginning to understand what they had lost in the process. But not everyone was changing. Oberst Klaus Reinhardt watched all of this from a distance with growing concern. Every Sunday he saw more men gathering at the fence. Every Sunday he heard them coming back to the barracks, talking about the American cook who treated them like human beings instead of like prisoners. This was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of weakness that would destroy discipline and order. If the prisoners started to see Americans as people started to question the righteousness of the cause they had fought for, then everything Reinhardt had built would collapse. He called Ludwig Krantz to his quarters one Sunday evening after the smoke had cleared and the men had returned from the fence. "This has to stop," Reinhardt said quietly. The American cook. The men gathering at the fence. The fraternization. The softening of resolve. It has to stop. Krantz nodded slowly. "You want me to make an example. I want you to remind the men what happens when they forget who they are. Choose carefully. Not someone too popular. Not someone who will create martyrs, but someone visible enough that the message is clear." Krantz smiled. He already knew who it would be. Emil Bauer, the mechanic, the first one to eat the Americans' food, the one who had worked side by side with the enemy fixing their generator, the one who had, in Krantz's opinion, betrayed everything they stood for. "Consider it done, Oberst." Reinhardt turned back to the window, watching the last wisps of smoke drift across the compound. He should have felt satisfied. He should have felt like he was doing the right thing, maintaining order, preserving discipline. Instead, he felt tired. So very tired. He had not told Krantz about what happened 3 nights ago. How he had been unable to sleep and had walked out into the darkness and had smelled the faint residue of mesquite smoke still lingering in the air. How that smell had transported him instantly back to Berlin, to his kitchen, to Sunday afternoons with his wife and son before everything fell apart. How he had stood there in the darkness for 20 minutes, breathing in that smell, and had felt tears on his face for the first time since Stalingrad. How he had walked to the fence and found a paper plate with a few scraps of meat still on it left behind by someone who had eaten their fill. How he had picked up one piece, put it in his mouth, and tasted something that reminded him of being human instead of being a soldier. How he had gone back to his quarters and wept silently into his pillow, overwhelmed by the sudden realization of everything he had lost, everything he had sacrificed, everything he had destroyed in service of an ideology that now felt hollow and cold. He had not told Krantz any of that. And tomorrow, when Krantz beat Emil Bauer bloody in the latrine as punishment for fraternizing with the enemy, Reinhardt would say nothing, would do nothing, would maintain the order that was all he had left. But tonight, standing alone in his quarters, Klaus Reinhardt understood something that terrified him. The American cook with his smoker and his stories and his kindness was doing something that no amount of propaganda or re-education or military discipline could accomplish. He was showing them that there was another way to be. And once you saw that, once you understood that the world didn't have to be built on hate and fear and rigid hierarchy, you could never unsee it. The smoke was changing them. All of them. Even the ones who were desperately trying not to change. Especially the ones trying not to change. The attack happened on a Tuesday night in late September, 3 months after Mercer had first lit his smoker. Emil Bauer was walking back from the latrine at 2200 hours when 3 men stepped out of the shadows between the barracks. He recognized them immediately. Ludwig Krantz and 2 of his associates men who did the dirty work that kept the Nazi underground functioning inside Camp Bowie. "Going somewhere, traitor." Krantz's voice was soft, almost gentle. That made it worse somehow. Emil didn't run. There was nowhere to run to. "I'm going to my bunk." "You've been spending a lot of time with the Americans, working on their machines, eating their food, forgetting who you are." "I haven't forgotten anything. I'm just trying to survive until I can go home." Krantz stepped closer. "There is no home anymore. Don't you understand that Germany is gone? Everything we knew is gone. All we have left is each other and our principles. And you've betrayed both." The first punch caught Emil in the stomach, doubling him over. The second hit his face, splitting his lip and sending him to his knees. Then they were all on him, fists and boots, methodical and thorough. Emil tried to protect his head, tried to curl into a ball, but there were too many of them, and they knew exactly what they were doing. How to hurt someone badly without killing them. How to send a message that would be heard throughout the compound. When they were done, Krantz knelt down next to Emil's bleeding form. Let this be a lesson. The American cook can't protect you. His food and his kindness mean nothing. We are still in control here. We will always be in control. They left him there in the dirt between the barracks, barely conscious, tasting blood and dirt and failure. Franz Adler found him 20 minutes later. Franz had been unable to sleep, had been walking the compound trying to quiet his thoughts when he heard the sound of labored breathing coming from the shadows. Scheisse, Franz whispered when he saw Emil's face. Can you walk? Emil tried to speak, but only managed to cough up blood. Franz made a decision that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. He didn't go to Reinhardt. He didn't go to the German camp leaders. He ran to the fence and started shouting in broken English for the American guards. Help man hurt, need help now. 2 guards came running, rifles ready, thinking it might be an escape attempt or a fight. When they saw Emil lying in the dirt, bleeding from a dozen different wounds, they called for the medic and unlocked the gate. Within minutes, Emil was being carried to the American medical facility. Within an hour, word had spread throughout the entire prisoner compound about what had happened. And the next morning, something unprecedented occurred. At morning roll call, when the prisoners were supposed to form up in neat ranks for counting 200 men, refused to move. They stood in a loose crowd near the fence, silent and still making no threats, but also making no move to cooperate with the daily routine. Captain Voss arrived furious and confused. What the hell is going on here? One of the prisoners, a former Wehrmacht officer named Dieter Hoffmann, who had never caused trouble before, stepped forward. His English was excellent, cultured, the product of 2 years studying at Oxford before the war. Captain, we are refusing to work until you guarantee the safety of Emil Bauer and investigate who attacked him. Voss's face went red. You're prisoners of war. You don't get to make demands. You don't get to refuse orders. Get into formation immediately, or I'll have every one of you written up for insubordination. Then write us up, Captain. We're not moving until we have your word that Emil will be protected and his attackers will be identified and punished. This had never happened before. Prisoners didn't organize. Prisoners didn't make collective demands. Prisoners certainly didn't stand up to American officers and refuse to back down. Voss looked at the crowd of silent, stubborn men and realized he was facing something he had no training or procedures to handle. Wait here, he said finally, and went to find Colonel Hayes. Hayes listened to Voss's report with an expression that might have been surprise or might have been grim satisfaction. It was hard to tell. 200 men refusing to work unless we protect one prisoner from their own people. Yes, sir, it's unprecedented. I recommend we isolate the ringleaders and make it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Hayes stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the crowd of German prisoners standing motionless by the fence. Captain, 3 months ago, we had a Nazi underground murdering prisoners who showed signs of doubt. We had 17 men dead and no way to stop it. Now we have 200 prisoners willing to risk punishment to protect one of their own from that same underground. And you want to punish them for that? Sir, with respect, We can't allow prisoners to dictate terms. They're not dictating terms, Captain. They're asking us to do what we should have been doing all along, protecting prisoners from violence within the camp. Hayes turned back to Voss. Find out who attacked Emil Bauer. Bring them to me, and tell those 200 men that we will investigate and we will ensure Emil's safety. They have my word. Sir, how are we supposed to identify the attackers? We don't have witnesses. We don't have evidence. Then get creative, Captain. Talk to people. Offer immunity to anyone who provides information. Make it clear that we're serious about this. Voss left still unhappy but following orders. Hayes sat back down at his desk and allowed himself a small smile. 3 months ago, this camp had been a powder keg of violence and extremism. Now prisoners were organizing peaceful protests to protect each other from Nazi enforcers. Something had changed, something fundamental. And it had all started with a cowboy and a smoker made from a salvaged oil drum. The investigation didn't take long. When Hayes made it clear that anyone who provided information about the attack would receive better treatment and potentially early work release privileges, 3 prisoners came forward within 24 hours. All 3 independently identified Ludwig Krantz and his 2 associates as Emil's attackers. Hayes had them arrested and placed in solitary confinement pending formal charges. More importantly, he called Oberst Klaus Reinhardt to his office for a conversation that had been a long time coming. Reinhardt arrived precisely on time, walking with the rigid posture of a man who had spent his entire adult life in military service. He sat when directed, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Oberst, I'm going to be direct with you," Hayes said. 3 of your men attacked Emil Bauer. They've been identified by multiple witnesses. They'll face formal charges and likely significant punishment. But before that happens, I need to know something. Did you order this attack? Reinhardt met his eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly, he shook his head. "No, Colonel, I did not order it, but I knew it was going to happen. Krantz reported his intentions to me, and I did nothing to stop it." Hayes studied him. "Why?" "Because I thought it was necessary. I thought we needed to maintain discipline and order. I thought that allowing the men to grow soft to fraternize with their captors would be a betrayal of everything we stood for." Reinhardt's voice was quiet, almost emotionless, but something was happening behind his eyes. "I was wrong." "Wrong about what?" "About everything, Colonel. About what discipline means. About what order requires. About what we stand for and what we've become." Reinhardt looked down at his hands. "My son died at Stalingrad, 20 years old. He believed in the cause, believed in the Führer, believed in the 1,000-year Reich. He died believing those things. And for 2 years I've held on to those beliefs because letting go of them would mean his death was meaningless." Hayes waited, saying nothing. "But 3 nights ago I couldn't sleep, and I walked outside, and I smelled smoke from Sergeant Mercer's cooking. And that smell reminded me of my home in Berlin, of Sunday dinners with my wife and my son before everything fell apart. And I realized something." Reinhardt looked up and Hayes saw that his eyes were wet. "My son didn't die for a cause. He died because old men like me filled his head with lies and sent him to freeze in a Russian winter. And now younger men like Krantz are doing the same thing here, perpetuating the same violence and hatred, and I've been helping them do it." "What are you telling me, Oberst?" "I'm telling you that I will testify against Krantz and his associates. I will identify every member of the Nazi underground in this camp. I will help you dismantle the shadow government that has been operating here since we arrived. Reinhardt's voice was steady now. And then I would like to request that you treat me exactly the same way you treat them, because I am just as guilty. More guilty, perhaps. I had the authority to stop this, and I chose not to. Hayes sat back in his chair processing what he had just heard. This was the man who had run the Nazi underground with iron discipline for months. The man who had maintained order through fear and violence. And now he was offering to dismantle everything he had built. I'm not interested in punishing you for having a change of heart, Oberst. I'm interested in making sure no more men die in this camp. Help me do that, and we'll call it even. Reinhardt nodded slowly. Thank you, Colonel. Don't thank me yet. You're going to have to face those 200 men who stood up for Emil Bauer. You're going to have to live with what you've done and who you've been. That's a harder punishment than anything I could hand down. That afternoon, with Reinhardt's testimony, Hayes dismantled the Nazi underground completely. 15 men were identified as key enforcers and placed in isolation. The shadow court that had condemned 17 prisoners to death was exposed and disbanded. And suddenly, for the first time since Camp Bowie had opened, the prisoners were free to think and speak and question without fear of midnight violence. The change was immediate and dramatic. Within a week, prisoner volunteers for work details increased by 300%. Men who had been silent and sullen started asking questions about America, about democracy, about what would happen after the war ended. A group of prisoners requested English language lessons. Another group asked if they could start a newsletter to share news and information. Captain Voss, who had fought Mercer's methods for months, stood in the compound one afternoon, watching prisoners and American guards playing an impromptu soccer game together, laughing and shouting in a mixture of German and English, and realized that something impossible had happened. The enemy had stopped being the enemy. He found Mercer in the kitchen preparing for Sunday's smoke. "Sergeant, I owe you an apology." Mercer looked up from the pork shoulder he was seasoning. "Sir, I fought you every step of the way, wrote you up, tried to get you transferred. I thought you were undermining discipline and security. I thought you were making us weaker." Voss paused. "I was wrong. You did something I couldn't do. Something all my regulations and procedures and re-education programs couldn't do. You made them see us as human beings, and once they saw that everything else followed." Mercer wiped his hands on his apron. "I didn't do much, Captain. I just cooked food and told stories. The rest was them. They chose to listen. They chose to change. All I did was give them permission." Permission for what? Permission to be something other than what they'd been told they had to be. Permission to doubt, to question, to remember that they were men before they were soldiers. Mercer looked out the window toward the compound where the soccer game was still going on. "I lost my wife because I didn't have money for medicine. I killed a German soldier in the last war because I was scared and 17 and didn't know any better. I've spent 25 years carrying guilt for things I couldn't change. But this helping these men remember who they are. That's something I could do. And if it makes up even a little bit for what I've done wrong, then it was worth every violation I committed." Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, Sergeant, I'm glad I didn't succeed in getting you transferred." "Me too, sir. Me too." November 1943. Camp Bowie had become something unprecedented in the American prisoner of war system. A model facility where cooperation was the norm rather than the exception. where prisoners volunteered for work not because they were forced, but because they wanted something to do, where the line between captors and captives had blurred into something more complicated and more human. And then the prisoners decided to do something that would be talked about for decades. They organized a Thanksgiving dinner. It wasn't Thanksgiving. It was 3 weeks early, actually. But a group of prisoners led by Franz Adler and Emil Bauer approached Mercer with a request. They wanted to cook a meal for the American guards, to say thank you, to celebrate not the holiday itself, but the idea behind it. Gratitude, community, the recognition that even in the middle of a war, there were things worth being grateful for. Mercer brought the request to Colonel Hayes, who approved it immediately. On a cold Sunday in early November, prisoners and guards worked together to prepare a feast. 3 turkeys that Mercer had somehow procured through his network of favors and trades, 50 pounds of potatoes, beans and cornbread, and apple pie made from canned apples and hope. They ate together in the compound, 500 men sitting at long tables sharing food and stories and laughter. Franz Adler stood up at one point, cleared his throat nervously, and spoke in careful English that he had been practicing for weeks. "We are prisoners, but today we are free, because one man showed us we are still human. Thank you, Sergeant Mercer." The applause was thunderous. Men on both sides of what used to be an unbridgeable divide stood and clapped and cheered. Mercer sat with his head down, overwhelmed, unable to meet anyone's eyes because they were wet with tears he didn't want anyone to see. That night, Emil Bauer approached him with something wrapped in cloth. "For you, Sergeant. I make this." It was a wooden spoon hand carved beautiful in its simplicity. Burned into the handle were the words, "Danke für alles." Thank you for everything. Mercer held the spoon like it was made of gold. "I can't accept this, son. This is too much." "You give us life back," Emil said simply, "is not too much." Mercer looked at this young mechanic from Stuttgart who had been the first to trust him, the first to cross the invisible line, the first to pay the price for that courage and survive anyway. And he thought about the photograph in his wallet, the German soldier's wife and son, the family destroyed by war and fear, and a 17-year-old boy's terrified decision in a foggy trench. He couldn't bring that soldier back, couldn't undo what he'd done. But maybe he'd saved enough lives here to balance the scales a little bit. Maybe the ghost he'd been carrying for 25 years could finally rest. "Thank you, Emil. I'll treasure this." That night, Mercer took out the photograph he'd carried since 1918. He looked at it one more time. The woman, the small boy, the family he'd broken without meaning to. And then he wrote on the back in pencil words he hoped might someday reach them if the universe was kinder than it had any right to be. "I'm sorry. I tried to make it right. I hope it was enough." He put the photograph back in his wallet, but it felt lighter now. Not gone, never gone, but lighter. In his quarters, Klaus Reinhardt sat at his desk and finished a letter he'd been writing for 3 days. A letter to his daughter-in-law in Germany, his son's widow, trying to explain what had happened to him in a prison camp in Texas. Trying to find words for a transformation he barely understood himself. "I used to believe that order was everything," he wrote. "That discipline and hierarchy and unwavering loyalty were the only things that mattered. I raised your husband to believe those things too. And it killed him. But I've learned something here that I wish I could have taught him before it was too late. I've learned that kindness is stronger than fear, That compassion builds more lasting order than violence ever could. That one man with a smoker and a generous heart can change the world in ways that entire armies cannot. He signed the letter, sealed it, and placed it in the outgoing mail. He didn't know if it would reach her, didn't know if she would read it or burn it, or simply set it aside. But he had to try. Outside smoke drifted across Camp Bowie one more time. Mercer was cooking again. He would cook every Sunday until the war ended. And every Sunday, men who had been enemies would gather by a fence that no longer seemed quite so high, and they would eat together and talk together and remember together what it meant to be human. The smoke had broken the swastika, not through force, not through propaganda, but through something simpler and stronger and more enduring. Through the recognition that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the ideology, they were all just men, far from home, trying to survive, trying to find their way back to the people they used to be. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday afternoons, in the middle of a war that was enough. May 1945, the war ended. Camp Bowie began releasing prisoners. Emil Bauer stood at the gate with 78 other men who had requested to stay in America. They shook hands with guards who had become friends. Franz Adler returned to Germany carrying Mercer's BBQ recipe written on a greasy napkin. Tom Mercer went back to Texas, bought a small ranch near Abilene, fixed windmills, cooked barbecue on Sundays, never married again, never sought recognition. Every year on November 11th, letters arrived from Germany, from Emil, from Franz, from men whose names Mercer had barely learned, but whose lives he had changed. 1981. Mercer died at age 80. 12 people attended his funeral. 5 had flown from Germany. Emil Bauer, now 60, held the wooden spoon he had carved in 1943 and wept like a child. 2015. A restaurant in Stuttgart called Mercer's Fire hosted a reunion. 15 men, all in their 90s, gathered around a smoker. They cooked brisket using mesquite wood imported from Texas. They told their grandchildren about a cowboy who had shown them that kindness could break hate. Franz Adler's granddaughter asked, "Was he a hero, Opa?" Franz, 91 years old, smiled. "No, Liebling. He was just a man who carried guilt and turned it into grace. That's rarer than heroes." They raised glasses of beer. "To Sergeant Mercer, the man who taught us to sit down." Outside smoke drifted across Stuttgart, sweet, sharp, carrying memory and redemption across 70 years. The photograph Mercer had carried still exists. It sits in a museum in Berlin, donated by Emil's family. On the back in faded pencil, "I'm sorry, I tried to make it right. I hope it was enough." Beneath that, in different handwriting, someone added years later, "It was, thank you." The smoke had broken the swastika, and in doing so, it had healed the man who lit the fire.